If you can please start us off by giving an overview of the past and present relationship between AI and religion, and perhaps focusing on Abrahamic or Western streams and Africana traditions, as that is your forte.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for this invitation, and delighted to join the other panelists here. It's a terrific question, and so I'll just briefly highlight a couple of things. When we think about AI and religion in the context of Abrahamic religions, of course, if you open up the Talmud or the New Testament, you're not going to find anything about AI religion. But there are lots of implications and connections here. It's actually more helpful to think about what is really pointed to with artificial intelligence. So if we can back away from, say, Siri for a moment or Google Assistant and think about that machine intelligence. Can things think? Can machines know things? And if we think about it that way, that these are non-human actors, entities that are at the center of this question of what can be known, can intelligence actually happen in something that's not a human? Then we can actually pretty quickly discern a very long history of attempts to wrestle with where intelligence happens, where does knowledge actually get constituted, who or what can be a knower. And there's actually a very long history of that shapes very contemporary attitudes towards some of the very present iterations of machine intelligence. And just to give a couple of examples, in the 1100s, Ibn Rushd, who's also known as Averroes, was very influential in shaping global understandings of intelligence, of thinking, of intellection. So he wrote a very influential treatise known as his long commentary on the De Anima. So this was an Aristotelian text that was trying to explain what makes things alive. It got written a long time ago, 2,500 years ago. And Ibn Rushd was actually very influential in shaping a long history of ideas about the soul as the knower, right? So things that know or entities that have a soul can know, and those entities are human. So humans can know because they have a soul. Intellection is something that happens because there is a soul. That actually was very influential on many people who gained prominence in these Western traditions, and also we can say global traditions of knowledge of what things can do. And the gist of that tradition is that things, so material entities, can't actually know anything. Material entities don't do intellection. That's Ibn Rushd, and that is the tradition that he helped to really make very popular and widespread. So by that logic, knowing can only happen with humans because only humans have a soul that knows. Only humans have this intellecting soul. And we see iterations of that in Judaism, Christianity, in Islam, long traditions, normatively speaking, about where knowledge can happen. If we look at Africana religions, just by contrast, if we think about the way objects are material entities are treated as having the capacity to provide information. They can be information. Think of doing a reading with some material objects, for example. These could be cowrie shells. It could be cards. It could be any other material objects that might happen in a tradition of Orisha devotion or historically in Congolese religion. These are examples of Africana religions in which these material entities are used in order to provide information about people, to interpret a dream, to make a diagnosis of someone's health condition. There's this understanding that knowledge can act, that information can actually be shared, transmitted, held by non-human material entities. And I'm shortening that a little bit because if we get into the weeds in these Africana traditions, that distinction between humans and non-humans begins to break down quickly. But I'm trying to just summarize this. That's a contrast, right? We could, if we wanted to be very crass and simplistic and unnuanced, we could say that we could see a contrast in Africana religious traditions, which do recognize any material entities to be part of this larger array of things that exist in the universe that can be information. But they can know things, they can transmit knowledge, okay? They can observe people. You can wear something that has been fashioned to provide protection for someone, and it can surveil you, and it can know what you're doing. And on the other hand, again, being crass, Abrahamic religions, if we look at the majority of how those things are played out in Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, knowledge is something that happens with people. So if we look at contemporary iterations of, say, your GPS, many people today, whether or not they identify as religious, might actually not want to entertain the idea that your GPS actually knows anything. It's just performing math, but it can't know anything. And what we see there is actually an example of this long history of influence, of thinking about knowledge as something that only happens among humans. So that's a quick summary. It's unnuanced. There are lots and lots of exceptions to that, but that's a quick and dirty version.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson.
Sure.
I'm intrigued by the framing of how you've started this conversation with Ibn Rushd, Averroes, and I have some follow-up questions for you on that, but I'm going to go to Robert next. So Robert, your forthcoming book takes a look at Indian perspectives on AI, which, by the way, I'm ethnically Indian, so I'm fascinated that you spent time in that part of the world. Could you give us a preview of what you've seen in that context, and how might that be similar or different from our Western context?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna quickly retreat to something kind of like that question of how much nuance we can add. You know, it's become kind of a truism that we can't know all the things worth knowing, and we barely even know a small section of what might be worth knowing. So in thinking about religions outside the Abrahamic fold, I was kind of asked to think about, you know, the eastern side of the world, right? We have this term, the East, as though those are cleanly and neatly differentiated from the West. And I'm happy to answer questions related to that, and to think about India, and specifically in my case, kind of Brahminical Hinduism in India. And my position there is as an observer, not as a participant in any of the traditions about which I might speak. And so here I am speaking on behalf of billions of people, which is like patently absurd, but I'll kind of give it a try. Contemporary headlines point to willing engagement with AI in Asian nations, from Buddhist funeral priests to robots that offer sacrifice to Hindu gods. These draw on long cultural traditions, the role of machines, right? Because the way in which people engage with machines in different cultures has varied, right? And you might have, for example, in Japan, rituals around printing blocks or around dolls, things that don't necessarily make sense in the kind of Abrahamic communities, but nevertheless exist in certain Buddhist and Shinto traditions, right? And in India, we're seeing the willing adoption of machines into kind of temple environments, right? So if machines are present in ritual practice by, you know, say a robot arm that offers arti or the sacrifice of light to the gods, or perhaps even the gods present in an icon that is self-robotic, the more relevant that conversation becomes for religious people. And the conversation about AI already permeates global pop culture and tech policy. I myself have a long-standing interest in how futurist narratives occupy our engagement with AI. We see this in singularity theories, dreams of mind uploading, expectations of cosmic evolution of humanity into machines, right, in pop science, most famously in the work of Hans Moravec, the roboticist, and Ray Kurzweil, the engineer, but there are a whole bunch of others. And we see it in science fiction going back 100 years to George Bernard Shaw and up to contemporary Netflix shows like Altered Carbon. We see people thinking about this idea of human evolution into some post-human state. I myself am agnostic, though pretty skeptical about those kinds of things. But in India, as in the US, you know, in the US, those narratives are now really quite rooted. And in India, those narratives are starting to gain a foothold thanks to smartphones and Netflix and so forth. The first folks who attended to Ray Kurzweil and others were basically ignored, but now there is an increasing interest, and you see it in pop science magazines like Dream 2047. There's even a Singularity Cafe in Chennai. But there are also other interesting narratives that happen in India, combinations with existing narratives, such as the belief that Kalki will come as a robot. Kalki is the final avatar of the god Vishnu, who comes in Hindu mythology to end the world we're living in and inaugurate the new one. And now in the last few years, we've been seeing people, everyone from tech hipsters in Chennai to sadhus in the mountains of Nepal, saying that perhaps Kalki would come as an AI. And as a quick contrast, no one has ever told me that Jesus might do that. So I take that to be a difference worth thinking about. So some people might say a god could be a robot, and definitely a robot can participate in a ritual that's already happening, and maybe even be the earthly presence of God in a ritual. But there are also interesting philosophical conflicts over all this. If we ask whether AIs can be conscious in the Hindu context, one of the fascinating elements of Hindu thought is that you could argue that a machine could be intelligent, but still not conscious. And by that, I mean as intelligent or more intelligent than a human being, but consciousness is something different. And that distinction doesn't meaningfully exist in most Western religious or philosophical thought. Finally, as like one little addition here, is the question of ethics, right? To my mind, if we talk about singularities, maybe that's going to happen and machines will take over the world. But mostly when we talk about machines gloriously recreating the world, that makes our own concerns trivial. And we need a real kind of ethics debate that when we look at something like Hinduism and Indian culture, we do see people already trying to apply cultural values and ethics to the way they're thinking about AI. That going from things like dharma or duty, what are our mutual duties to one another, to the idea of swaraj or self-rule. What does it mean to be in control of my own life? So we need to open, in some sense, our conversation, our discussion to this variety of cultural values, because some of them might change how we think about the design and deployment of AI. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. That was really interesting. I'm curious as to, following up on that with a question around, and maybe I'll have you think about that a little bit, because I think what Sylvester mentioned and what you were talking about, the contrast between the Abrahamic traditions and what we would call like the Near Eastern and Eastern traditions, and where is it that we can think about some of those similarities, but then also the stark differences around the idea of a soul, and if certain avatars, for example, can even lead service, whereas in the other, maybe the Abrahamic traditions, that may not even be a possibility or considered a possibility due to some of the fundamental jurisprudential differences. But I'll follow up with you on that. So Rosalind, hi. So from your vantage point as a computer scientist, what has been your experience of the interface between AI and religion, and in particular in your field or personal work? Are there any specific examples or case studies you would like to highlight for us?
Thank you so much for including me. I have so much to learn from these other viewpoints that I really haven't seen much of that intersecting with the kind of AI we build directly. In reflecting on my experiences with AI, I'm thinking of kind of three phases. And the first was very much what I think a lot of people in AI experience, which is like a mountain climber seeing Everest and wanting to know if they can do it. We see humans and we're so in awe of how the human works. We wonder if we could build it. And it's not because we want to be God or something like that. It's because we want it. It's so amazing how it works. We want to understand it. And some people, I think, do want to kind of conquer it. But I'd say most people are just intrigued, like, is it possible? Can I climb it? Can I build it? And as I started learning about the human brain, I started learning about the actually important and useful and rational roles of emotion in intelligence, and proposed that we give computers skills of emotional intelligence, which was looked at as a really bad idea when I first proposed it. Really bad idea. People were like, you're going to throw away your career with this one. I wrote a book called Affective Computing that led to actually what has turned into a lot of real work trying to understand it and use the technology to understand emotion, which brought me kind of into phase two. One day, a young man knocks on my door to borrow a map for a bike trip. And he says, what do you work on? I said, oh, I'm trying to teach this computer to recognize facial expressions. And he said, recognizing like emotion. And I said, well, it doesn't always mean what you're feeling, but, sometimes you are clearly trying to signal emotion with your face. And yeah, trying to teach the computer to recognize when that happens. And he said, could you help my brother? And I said, tell me about your brother. And I realized, this doesn't just affect people on the autism spectrum. He went on to tell me all about his brother on the autism spectrum. Not only seeing impaired people, but lots of people have a nonverbal disability where they just don't read the affective signals that we send deliberately or authentically or in a fake way. And they miss a lot of important communication. So I realized what we were building actually didn't have to just be directed at making the AI better. It could actually concretely be built into things that might be able to help people like his brother. So we started doing that. And then I wound up learning so much more from people on the autism spectrum than I ever expected. At first I thought, oh, we're going to help them. Turned out actually they were helping us, both in the ways they think and alternate ways of seeing detail and making systematic things that we didn't know how to make systematic. So that kind of led into phase 3, which was, I'm thinking, I'm getting all these cool new ideas how to build much better AI. And I was talking with Marvin Minsky, one of the founding parents of the field of AI. I've worked with John McCarthy in the early days when John named AI. And Marvin was saying, the vision was to build AIs that were so awesome and amazing that we'd be lucky if they kept us around as household pets. Now, I had never quite heard it that way. And when Marvin said that, it was like the wet blanket, like really, like my children are going to look at their mom or my grandchildren like somebody who helped convert us all into household pets. Is that really what I want my legacy to be? And I realized, and as I immersed more in a much more diverse culture in the Media Lab and got a lot more different viewpoints on this, there's so much need to build AI that improves human lives and not to like make us obsolete. And the problems are actually as hard, if not harder in many ways. They're intellectually fascinating. And we can get all the joys of trying to climb Everest and the even greater joys of impacting and improving lives around us if we really take time to learn these needs. That then brought in a whole lot of need to understand more about religion, and so much we can learn from these viewpoints. And also just the values that I realized come from, my religious worldview in contrast with some other people's religious worldviews that have very dramatically now shaped the work that we're doing.
Thank you, Dr. Picard, and thank you for just being such a trailblazer in this work. My father is a neurosurgeon, and so when you really were talking about some of the connecting points with the work you're doing with AI and the brain and the very practical ways in which you're helping humanity, it's just profound. All three of you have touched a little bit on some of the history as well as like where we are in terms of utilizing artificial intelligence. I'm curious as to where you all see the next frontier in the next, let's say, 20 years or so, both some of the threats that people may feel from artificial intelligence, because I did hear a little bit of that, right? Dr. Johnson, when you talked about the what we call the Western traditions, right? In particular, let's say the monotheistic traditions, there's, I think, an appreciation for what technology and AI has offered, but there are some very deep questions about whether AI can replace, let's say, a rabbi. When, Robert, you mentioned in, the Buddhist temple or actually in Japan, as you know, there's the idea of like having a goddess that you can go to and receive a blessing from. And then you spoke a little bit about in the Hindu tradition with the arti and the concept of incorporating these avatars that are robots into the actual puja. But there are some other traditions where that actually may not find a parallel. And in some ways, it may actually be seen as a threat, right, to the actual existence of that tradition. So I'm curious as to where you see this going and What are some of those, warranted threats that people may feel from AI? And that, for you, Rosalind, I think that if not in the realm of religious practice, what are, some of the notions that that you have experienced around the fears that people have of new technology, AI replacing human connection? So I'll have either one of, Sylvester, if you want to take a jab at it first.
Sure. Yeah, these are great questions. I'll point to one thing that's related to some of the things that Robert and Rosalind have already identified. So the one way to think about the frontier and emerging technology in AI space is humans versus machines. But as has already been articulated in fascinating ways in the panel, it's humans with machines that I think are actually going to create some of the more profound practical challenges. And I'll give an example. So the leading military industrial states globally are expending tens of billions and hundreds of billions of dollars to develop weaponized AI. And so AI for warfare, this is for targeting, so-called smart missiles, that kind of thing, but also modifying human soldiers to make them more effective in warfare and to restore lost capacities due to something like traumatic brain injury. So the Pentagon in the United States spends a lot of money to develop really what I would call third rail cutting edge AI in combining people with machines. Cybernetics is the fancy term for that. And this is through brain chips, for example, that can allow someone who's had a traumatic brain injury to be able to walk again, have normal speech again, have restored memory or speech capacity. So that research is very well funded, it's very serious. And US is just an example. There are other military industrial states. Think of what comes to mind: Germany, Israel, Iran, China, who are pouring money into this. Because of the high stakes of AI, I think it's fair to say that the recruitment of talent and the amount of capital that's going into those kinds of technologies is not going to come to naught. I think that actually will produce pretty profound results. And I'll give one example. If at some point in the future a human goes into special ops and not only needs recovery from traumatic brain injury, nothing's wrong with them. You can just enhance their abilities. You can install a brain chip. You can give them infrared vision. You can allow them to communicate wirelessly with the drone so they can see what the drone's seeing, and also with other people who also have the brain chip. And they do their special things that people in special ops do, and then they come out and they're a civilian. So now they're part of their neural architecture, their brain architecture, is it's not 100% organic human, it's part machine. And so one way that this question of AI versus human could come up is politically, should that person be able to marry, vote, raise children? Someone could say, well, Sylvester, you're not fully human. Your brain is part machine now. How do we know? We don't think machines can love, only humans can love. How do we know you can love these children? Because your brain is now part machine. Or how do we know you can vote? How do we know you're not just being hacked by whoever has the most money to manipulate the AI? So you shouldn't be allowed to vote anymore, Sylvester, right? So that's an example that may sound sort of far-fetched, but when you think about the amount of capital and talent globally that's going into these kind of outcomes, I think what it demonstrates is that it's not necessarily AI versus humans in some of the film scenarios that we see that might be the nearest challenges that we face at first, but rather it might be the question of human rights, the political spectrum of freedoms and responsibilities that people can have based on whether or not they've been enhanced, modified, combined with machine systems or synthetic biology. But we're talking about AI, so I'm talking about the implants. So that's an example of what I think is both an opportunity to be able to to extend the kind of work that Rosalind has pioneered. And that is really enhancing the quality of life for people by combining them with machine systems. You can have a wearable, or you can train this machine system to be able to work with people to provide emotional support or communication. But it's also an opportunity to weaponize. It's an opportunity to outsource decisions. I was going to say decision services, but it's decisions to a much more efficient algorithmic system that can act very quickly, but that can also create tremendous military consequences. And I think really it's the human machine, the cybernetic subject. That's where I think the rubber will hit the road soonest for us in trying to deal with the political implications of these developments.
If I can hop on that, I completely agree. You could see me nodding a lot, I guess. And by the way, it's not just me pioneering this. There's a huge number of people. I love seeing how much the AI community has started embracing more human-centered AI and AI that's about making lives better, whether it's respecting people's emotions, helping disabled people, expanding equality and justice with the technology, using it to level playing fields instead of just to keep giving more power to the rich. And there are certainly these very disturbing military things that we need to be having conversations about as a society. Because I think a different way to think about AI is not about replacing people, but as augmenting and amplifying and extending human intelligence and human ability, just like it enabled people, well, just like early mechanical machines increased our physical strength, our ability to lift things and build pyramids and buildings and so forth. Now, the cognitive and affective prostheses, if you will, are expanding our ability to handle and re-equip people who have certain diseases, limitations, visual limitations, affective limitations, anxiety and stress monitoring and regulation limitations, wearables and all that can help you see the panic attack coming and calm down beforehand, or see the seizure coming and get in a safe place beforehand, and maybe even take something that prevents it now. And while also gathering data and giving us insight into hopefully better treatments and solutions for these things in the future. So I'd like to sort of change the thinking from just building a human, which really is sort of the best device for eliciting fear, making movies, although there's been a lot. I mean, even in the first play that coined the word robot, the Chapek brothers, R U R, the robots wipe out the humans, right? There's just that sensational play. I think it's much more likely it's going to be humans using technology, hopefully not to wipe out humans, but to hopefully help people's lives be better.
Yeah, Robert, did you want to join in on that?
Sure. The quick segue there is that probably the best thing at eliciting the fear of human beings is another human being, right? That it's what's terrifying is what we might do with machines, not really the machines themselves. But for me, when I, and some of my work has been with like the G20 Interfaith Forum and that kind of thing on the future of religion and AI and how we might think about those things. A number of ways in which we might engage the question of whether or not human beings are going to do terrible things to one another with machines would be to think about how we're going to cooperate toward making a kind of better environment. And that means a technological environment, right? And that in part means rigorous education for religious leaders of whatever tradition, right? How will those people join policy discussions or counsel their lay public or whatever else if they haven't been educated to know what the technologies do? Too often religious leaders are either A, lagging way behind the technology and playing catch up, or B, and at which point they're reactionary by definition, or B, they're responding to vaporware, right? Like technologies that don't even exist but are the flavor of the day for us all to panic over. So we need those people to be in communication with their communities in ways that are productive. And we need both the leaders and the lay public. And I think this is really important, and it maybe goes back to some of those other things that I had to say earlier about avoiding hegemonic narratives, capital T truths. If I think my truth is a big old capital T truth, whether it's scientific or religious or whatever else, and that you need to believe it, we're not in a place to collaborate, right? We're not in a position to cooperate at that moment. And so we have to take the humility of putting that moment aside. And a fundamental way to do that, I think, is when we notice that things like religion are not just about belief. They're about what people do. And for many religions, belief is not even a primary point of interest. Hinduism, for example, provides space for folks to do a whole lot of different things and to participate while believing pretty much whatever they want. I myself am an agnostic but deeply committed Jew. So I see space to think about community contributions that are not grounded in assumptions about other people necessarily, but rather what we want to do in the world, rather than what we want other people to believe, right? If we put aside what I need you to believe, and I think about what we want to do, I think that that provides much greater leverage, and it promotes interreligious cooperation, and also probably, I don't know, I don't think we have good examples yet, but maybe religion technology cooperation, when it becomes about what we're trying to get done. So if I think about global value systems and how, and say, I take the goal of self-rule, Swaraj in India, the idea that I should be in control of my own life, that probably tells me something about what I want from AI technologies. It maybe tells me something about what I owe AI technologies if they ever get a whole lot better than they are right now. And I mean a whole lot better, like many orders of magnitude better than they are right now. But if I simultaneously think about Confucian systems of respect and obligation, I could benefit from examining the overlap and the differences in a kind of Venn diagram between that and Swaraj and maybe Christian agape. Like when I think about the efficiencies of technology and the power of AI to expand human capability, which is what Rosalind and Sylvester were just talking about, right? How do those intersect with other values in producing the world, in making the world one we want to live in? And that's an opportunity to think, how do I genuinely engage with other people? You know, what can I do in the world if I take all that seriously? And I think that's the conversation that people in the space who are intersecting with religion and AI need. They need to think about what they're trying to accomplish, because by and large, I think we're all probably trying to accomplish most of the same things, putting aside Marvin Minsky and that crowd who maybe they're trying to accomplish a whole new robotic species that makes us all look like you know, ladybugs or whatever. Putting aside that community and actually finding ways to cooperate with them too. You know, I think we all probably mostly want many of the same things in life. And that's what we should be like, you know, relentlessly pursuing. How do we find that moment with all of us, right? And, you know, that's enough. I'll stop there. I got to get past my academic desire.
Well, I think all three of you have highlighted that the intent, right, of AI has really been to bring significant change to the human condition. But one of the challenges, as was, you know, mentioned earlier, is where, you know, if there are ethics around what the next frontier brings for us, right? So when Sylvester, you talked a little bit about, you know, different military systems utilizing AI and incorporating that. The question, you know, the next question, of course, that I think many of us would ask is who governs the values within these systems, and what are those global values, if any, that help us navigate through new questions that may arise. And so, and this is especially when there are so many different systems in play and paradigms, but, you know, from different traditions around how they even perceive this, right? And some may welcome this, and some may actually say, no, this is actually sacrilegious in some ways. So, and as you were speaking, Rosalind, I was really curious, like in the work that you do, where do the values and the virtues, like what are those guiding principles and the ethics, like where does that come from?
It's a great question. And, you know, there's all this conversation about courses on ethics for engineers and so forth, but they still tend to focus on, you know, like preventing disasters. And that's a good thing to do. But, you know, like in the medical space, you know, we follow, I have collaborated with Empatica on 2 FDA clearances, right? And you just do extraordinary amounts of work trying to prove not only benefits, but that you've thought about every possible risk and you've done everything you can to mitigate it. And here's how you document everything you've done, and you continue to document it through manufacturing and code changes and everything. So you have to commit to it, but it has to be well defined. And one thing that really shocked me once when I was giving a talk in Beijing is I was talking about some of the work we'd done in autism and epilepsy, and not only what it had led to there, but how it had changed our thinking for AI and how we were doing things differently now, and how much I valued the amazing insights I got from this work. And some of the people were looking at me kind of peculiar, and and they had good English and they were getting translated. And afterwards, a couple of the professors and scientists pulled me aside and said, Professor Picard, and they said some nice things about the work, but then you could see the elephant in the room. A couple of them said, it's not our religious beliefs, but we know a lot of people here who believe that people who have these conditions are being punished for something in an earlier life. And why are you working to help them? Why are you shouldn't you work on something else? That's basically what they were saying. And I mean, I had sensed that they thought this was kind of like, don't touch this topic, which is why I spent so much work trying to tell them, truthfully, the benefits that it led to scientifically, as well as because they didn't seem too interested in helping these folks. And then when I heard the worldview that they were espousing, I realized that something I had taken for granted, which is all people, Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal in, United States. And we're always seeking this, right? We don't achieve it. We have a long way to go, but we believe that, or I believe, and realize not everybody else did, that we all are equal. And I realize now that worldview, some of you may have more expertise than me, but I realize it comes out of Genesis, out of the, Judeo-Christian scriptures, Imago Dei, all people, man and woman created in the image of God. God made them. And that is imprinted on each human being. Doesn't matter if what you believe, doesn't matter if you're abled or disabled, it doesn't matter what religion or culture you are, in this Imago Dei, all humans, no conditions attached there, are made in God's image. And then in Christianity, God so loved the world, right? Not for God so loved people who followed Jesus, but for God so loved the world, all people, that God sent God's Son for everyone. So there's this Christian worldview on top of this Judeo-Christian Genesis worldview that all people are equal, and we seek that kind of justice where all are treated equal. So I felt like there's just as much worth in this disabled person who can't speak, who's struggling to type something to communicate, equal worth to the greatest, most accomplished individual in our society. And right now they're not treated equally, right? So I see AI as an opportunity to try to remedy some of that. But that touches right on the, where does that come from? And somebody coming from a different worldview will completely disagree with me on that.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons to talk about what we want, right? What a person really wants. And as a side issue, I have a cousin who's Christian and she's deaf, and her parents were lambasted roundly for their own sins, which produced the deafness of my cousin, right? So I raise that only to say in all kinds of traditions, people have really what I take to be unfortunate perspectives on why any one person might be suffering in life, right? But when you ask someone, hey, if you were deaf, would you like me to help if I could? If it was your kid, that's why if we push away from belief toward what we actually really want, and that it kind of sometimes, and it's hard for all of us, we all have a hard time being in someone else's shoes. But when we get at the concrete ground, I think it's tremendously unfortunate that you had people pushing back on your work, saying, why would you bother? Because it's clearly their own fault, right? Like that kind of victim blaming is really unhelpful, right? That it's not people.
Well, they were very respectful and serious about it. I mean, they did sort of privately pulling me aside and saying, we kind of have a problem with this. And I'm like, really? I want to understand. And they explained, and I'm like, oh, okay. But it goes back to, what are your assumptions? And in our society today, people often don't question where they come from. They just kind of assume that everybody thinks everybody should be treated equally, and isn't it horrible that that's not happening? And they don't recognize where that comes from, that comes from, I know the source of Genesis. Maybe there are others, and certainly the Judeo-Christian worldview. And I know there's several other worldviews that differ.
This pushes to an ongoing question I have that I would love to hear both you and Sylvester respond to, which is really how we get religious groups and scientists and engineers to collaborate to ensure the value of technological development really for the most marginalized communities, for those who go unseen and unheard in technological progress, and who are, as often as not, the backs upon which that is built, right? Like, how do we get people to collaborate together to really produce change for the people who need it most?
Sylvester, that's all yours.
Those are great questions and great points. I would be remiss not to recognize the Henry Luce Foundation, which has granted funding, a $500,000 grant to Virginia Tech to do a series of workshops on future humans, human futures, which is bringing together experts in religion and theology and related humanities disciplines to engage with the ethical questions around technology. Now, that's anticipatory, forward-looking, and that's bringing together people from multiple religious traditions, but also focusing on underrepresented populations. Because the point of this question was around equity, right? How do we get to peoples who are along different vectors, numerical or power minorities, given whatever the context might be, whether it's persons with disabilities or Black, Indigenous people, other peoples of color, religious minorities, the poor. And so that's something that we're doing in order to try to achieve those equitable outcomes. And that is bringing together those individuals and putting them in the room with individuals and companies that are creating technological systems, that are developing algorithmic software, or that are designing defense protocols or military applications, so that they can understand what those applications are doing, what the real world scenarios are, and begin then to try to reflect on what some of the interventions and strategies need to be. I think that's just one example. That's not by itself going to solve our problems, but it certainly is part of the solution of getting different people who usually don't think of themselves as needing to sit in the same room, right? Someone who builds AI and someone who likes to read a philosophical text or write poetry, but or who is involved in some kind of civic activism. But I do think that we have to move further in understanding that technology is not just a STEM issue. It's a comprehensive human issue. And some of the questions and the most difficult challenges I like to point out in technology are actually not technical. And it's not that there's no profundity in the technical achievements. Just try to pick apart a smartphone. It's putting that together. I mean, it's just mind-bogglingly sophisticated. But if you make a list of the technical achievements and the technical challenges that we solved, you'd need to whip out, you couldn't do it on a napkin or a sheet of paper. You need to open a spreadsheet and start filling it in. If you make a list of the human side of the technology challenges that we've solved. So your questions are about values, right? How do we get to equity? How do we prevent exacerbating inequality with our technology systems? And how do we get equitable outcomes that are socially just, that are fair, that are not just another excuse to back up into nationalism? Because now we have techno-nationalism. Even though the platforms are global and the corporations are global because they need global talent, they're not invested in this nationalism because you can't make money doing that as a corporation. It just doesn't work. But our nation states have just used the technology all over again to invest in the nationalism, which is only going to make it more difficult for us to achieve the kind of interventions to address the inequality. So I think that's one way. Another quick thing I'd add is that when we talk about values, we need to be very serious in addressing value, as in financial value, as in money, because digital technology is set by the World Economic Forum's anticipatory analysis of this over the next decade or so to possibly more than double global GDP. And in other words, in the next 10 years, we might see the development of more new value creation in the decade. We might see more in the next decade than we've seen in all of human history. Think about that. Like, that could happen. And if that happens, and even if we get half of that, like if that's 50% wrong, it's still basically right. And the point is that we're going to generate so much new value largely through digital technologies. And a big chunk of that may be 15 or 20% through AI. And so it's an opportunity to figure out, how do we avoid just continuing to grow inequality? And how do we get to shared prosperity? That has to be global. It can't be based on nationalism. And it has to be based on really being deliberate and bringing in underrepresented peoples, those who are most highly vulnerable. And that depends on which vectors we're talking about. Okay, that needs to be context sensitive whenever we're developing these systems, and particularly when we're thinking about the future of wealth and value in that sense.
You know, what you all just shared, I'm going to actually move into the questions from our audience, because some of what you shared actually covers several of these questions that have come from the audience. And there's a reoccurring question around the idea of perhaps investigating algorithms and the fairness of algorithms in data science. And you know, considering basically moral foundation theory, which is about 6 independent dimensions of moral psychology, including care and harm, fairness, cheating, loyalty, betrayal, authority, sanctity, liberty, oppression. And basically the point I think the question is trying to make is, you know, where's the fairness in the algorithms? And humans with different cultural backgrounds and politics will weigh on these dimensions differently. So how much of this has been probed in terms of algorithm ethics in the context of the richness of the multidimensional world that we live in? And any of you can address that if you're interested.
I can jump on the easy part. Let me leave the hard part for Sylvester. You know, my work with the G20 Interfaith Forum, one of the things that came up repeatedly in our work with experts in the field, from scientists, engineers, science and technology studies people, policy people, was the need for algorithmic bias auditing, which is that if a company is working with, say, the federal government, that's where it's easiest, right? If you have a contract with the federal government, it should be mandated that you have a bias audit before, like, we give you money, right? And probably we want to wait to bring that into industrial practice also, right? Not just if you happen to be working with the US government or the Chinese government or whatever government you might pick, but that in general, we probably want it some other way. So like, on the one hand, there's a regulatory framework there, because there are all kinds of things that if you want to work with government X or government Y, you have to check the right boxes. And one of those boxes should be legally mandated to be a bias audit. Now, that said, the hard part of the question was actually, I mean, I guess the hard part in the US is getting our Congress to vote on anything at all. But you know, there's the hard part there is, how do we reconcile different people's beliefs about what constitutes that bias audit? And I think you probably, I'm going to just say one thing and then cede it to my colleagues. You probably start with the low-hanging fruit. We all know that a racist algorithm's a bad one, right? Like we could start there. We could, you know, a sexist algorithm would be a bad one. And if we could probably build from there, but I'll stop at that point with just the low-hanging fruit in that question.
If I can point to 2 other things, since time is tight and we want to have people have more interaction. One is the work of Joybull Amwini, recent PhD at the Media Lab, who formed the Algorithmic Justice League and has just done, I think, a fabulous job bringing together, you know, like, she's a real AI researcher, opening these conversations and going not with hype or, you know, crazy stuff, but with data to companies and saying, like, you know, look, you have this bias, this, you know, and they want to fix it. And what we find is that when you take that approach and you show people where these are, they don't want them to be there. And one of the nice things about algorithms and data is it's objective, right? Whereas when it's in people, I think people get away with hiding it and misusing it in even worse ways. That said, you got to go looking for it in the algorithms, right? It doesn't necessarily manifest itself until something bad happens. So there is a wonderful new movement in the AI community to try to really look for these things and ferret them out before they become a problem. The second thing I'll point you to is if you're interested in going deeper than the kinds of things I just described into a whole bunch of factors that affect it. I just co-authored a paper with Sharon Chung, Chiang, in Neurology. It's the top neurology journal. This particular paper is not general. It's taking in a domain like neurology and a lot of things we could see happening with AI and wearables and algorithms. And when it meets that domain, how do all of these ethical principles, the fairness, the bias, and beneficence, and not doing all of it, all kinds of ethical principles come into play? And how do we imagine how we might deal better with the ones that we can see now, and which other ones are we guessing might be arising? So I recommend that. It was published July 27th, 2021. First author is Sharon Chung, Chiang, in the journal Neurology.
Those are terrific. I'll add one quick thing. The Public Interest Technology University Network has been recently formed and supported initially by the Ford Foundation, and then more recently, along with other philanthropic entities. And the Ford Foundation has wanted to do for technology what they did very successfully with law in the 1960s. They focused on public interest law. So today we take for granted there are people who are working in law for advancing human rights or civil liberties, who are working not just for the benefit of private capital, but also for public interest. And that is the vision that the Ford Foundation has for technology. By creating more career pathways and emphasis on public benefit, they're not against private capital, they are private capital, but they recognize the need also to be able to bring about the focus on public benefit with technology. That's been a very important trend that now has resulted in close to 50 colleges and universities that are really deliberately aiming to prepare future talent that addresses the equity issues. It takes very seriously the need to be inclusive in the teams of people who are actually developing technology. If it's not inclusive and diverse, it's really losing the game almost before you've begun. And so they're focusing on that as well. So that's been another positive trend to try to achieve these equitable outcomes with technology.
Thank you. All three of you have given us some really great direction so that we can do our own research on this. There's another reoccurring question around promising strategies. So what do you see as promising strategies for helping religious leaders get technology education in a robust enough way to be helpful to their congregants, to the next generation? And in connection, there's a question around the participation of mainstream religions, which according to Pew is, in 2014, I believe, the research around 1 in 5 Americans is now a nun, NONE, not a habit wearing nun, but not necessarily prescribing to a particular religious tradition. But the same research, by the way, I want a disclaimer that it does not mean that Americans no longer care about spirituality or questions of meaning and purpose, right? So really the question around how can we utilize AI in helpful strategies that could both educate leaders as well as provide, maybe a reverse trend to following a particular organized tradition.
Sure. Since nobody else is saying anything, I will. I do know that here in the U.S. there is an organization called Science in the Seminaries, and I only know a person or two in that group. I think they take very seriously the goal of helping seminarians understand contemporary scientific progress, and I think that that's really important, right? In the U.S., we see You know, it's funny when I go to India, people are like, well, here, religion and science get along. It's not like in your country. And I usually say, what do you mean? What's it like in my country? And their assumptions are that in my country, there are all these like angry religious people and angry scientists, which by and large isn't really true. And in fact, you have religious scientists, you have scientists who don't care about religion, you have religious people who don't care. Like, by and large, people just get through life, right? But if someone who's going to be a religious leader is going to be a real leader, that person needs to be aware of what's going on in the culture they're living in. And so an effective science education, I think, is really important. But I think symmetry is really important. You know, if someone, one of the things I also sometimes moonlight as is a grant reviewer for the National Science Foundation. And I find it remarkable when people in things like human-computer interaction put into a grant proposal that they're going to spend X amount of time, 20% of the grants about ethics. But everybody writing about like the whole team are all engineers. And I'm like, hold on, why is it that engineers can do ethics, but ethicists can't, I don't know, build robots? Like, I mean, we all know why ethicists can't build robots, because they either can or they can't. They either have a robot at the end or they don't. But the assumption that anyone who just wants to talk about ethics can do that work is a really poor assumption. And just because ethicists argue with one another about what would be the best case scenario doesn't mean that they're like not a good voice in the room. So I think really what we want is a kind of accepting symmetry that says, okay, if we really want to talk about the ethics of this, you know, technology, that we need to accept that we're going to have to at least listen to some people tell us what that means, right? If we're in the scientific and engineering domain, we may not agree with them, but we at least got to listen fairly, right? And vice versa. I think we want religious leaders in training to listen fairly about what scientists are telling them. And we want scientists to listen fairly when someone comes to them and says, look, for my religious tradition, here's why this is a real problem. And then you may or may not change what you're doing, but at least you've listened and at least you've like grown a little bit as a human being in a community and whatever else.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, Robert. I love the point that you made in contrasting the engineers are presumed to be able to do ethics with the sophistication that should be able to win millions of dollars in a grant, but it doesn't work the other way around, right? And it's really undervaluing and underestimating the kinds of training and thoughtfulness of preparation that's required to bring the commensurate level of skill to these very difficult ethical challenges. You don't just wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to think about this. I mean, you should think about it, but expertise is still important. And expertise is not just technical. It's also humanities, social science, what we think of as creativity or political theory, whatever we're calling those things that are not STEM, they still require expertise. And I think that one of the ways that we've shot ourselves in the foot, and I think we're continuing to nationally and globally, there's a lot of, right now it's popular to be angry at big tech. 10 years ago, I mean, very few people cared. Now it's all the rage. And it's what I think it's important to hold companies accountable, but I think it's important to hold everyone accountable, not just corporations, governments, I mean, private philanthropic organizations, whatever people are doing. But if we don't correct the problem, where we have spent decades through our legislative assemblies defunding comprehensive education. Ever since Sputnik, we've just told people, look, what matters is math and science. And we have translated that into funding models and to educational standards and to social values. And the crisis now is that students go to college, they're scared to major in something that's not STEM because everyone's told them you're not going to be able to make a living, no one's going to hire you. Right? And what I think is unfortunate is that it's so popular politically to rage against big tech, but we haven't stopped defunding comprehensive education, and the things that people are raging about are not really at the root necessarily about technical difficulties. They're about the human frontier of technology. It's about fairness. It's about justice. It's about being equitable. and I love the way you phrased this question earlier, Tahera. You talked about governing technology. Like, how are we going to manage it? How are we going to get it to do what we need it to do so that we can have a world that we actually want to live in, instead of one that looks like Terminator or some other apocalyptic, scary film. And one of the things we need to do to get there is to stop this false narrative that claims that technology is really just technical. And what we need for technological society is really just STEM. And all that other stuff over there, defund it. Don't spend taxpayers' money on that. We're still shooting ourselves in the foot. The reason why we're in this situation is not because private companies are developing technology and now they make a lot of money, is because we required students who came to our universities who said that they wanted a career in technology. We required them not to be able to have a comprehensive education. We crammed their curriculum so full of only math and science, we didn't allow them to study these other things. And now we want to be angry at those students that our society created because we think they're threatening democracy, which is not a technical thing. It's a humanistic kind of thing. But we didn't even allow them to study democracy. It wasn't in their curriculum, right? I don't think we can have it both ways. I don't think we can force people into these curricula that take them into professions that we claim are the only things that matter to the global economy. And then when it starts to threaten things like freedom and fairness or democracy, then we want to beat our chest and point fingers at them, and we want to get on our high horse. But we're still defunding comprehensive education. And we're still saying to our school systems that the only talent we really need in the future is math and science. We're just creating the same problem all over again. And I think that hypocrisy in the way that we handle the funding of education and the way that we talk about values and the way that we valorize what people study, that hypocrisy will continue to undermine our ability to get to these values that we're talking about. So we definitely need to invest in the very best of our religious traditions. And we also need to invest in human traditions and trends that maybe they don't fit into religious labels per se, but they are necessary for human thriving. And the way that we have politicized the rage against big tech, I think, is not gonna get us what we need if we're not self-critical about what we've done as a society.